My name's David Lord, and I was asked by Candace Vetter, the organizer, to moderate the evening's discussion. And it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a real honor as well to participate in this and to learn from you and from our panelists about these issues. We have a group of community activists that most of you know and work with, I think, but also Richard Lindgren is going to be the keynote speaker. And what I'd like to do is just briefly introduce Richard and allow him to do his keynote address. And then there'll be presentations from each of the panelists from the community groups. And following that, a discussion period. There is a bit of biographical information about Richard on the agenda, but I'll read it off again for those who haven't had a look at it. He's a staff lawyer with the Canadian Environmental Law Association and represents citizens groups in the courts and before tribunals on various environmental issues, including air and water pollution, waste management, and natural heritage protection. He served as co-counsel for Walkerton residents at the Walkerton Inquiry and has been a member of the Environment Ministers Advisory Panel on Environmental Assessment, Environment Ministers Task Force on the Environmental Bill of Rights, Attorney General's Advisory Committee on Class Action Reform, and Environmental Review Tribunal's Client Advisory Committee. And he's an editor of the Canadian Environmental Law Reports and has taught environmental law at Queen's Faculty of Law and at Trent University. With all of that, Richard said to me briefly before we got started here that he's here to learn as well and is constantly learning. So despite all the qualifications, over to you, Richard.
Great. Thank you, David, and good evening, everybody. It's good to see so many friendly faces here and so many clients, I would say. Let me start by thanking Candace and the other organizers for inviting me here tonight. I think this is going to be a great opportunity for all of us to learn from each other, to perhaps find some common ground, and to maybe develop some common strategies that we can all use to fight risky landfill proposals all over Ontario. And I see that the title of tonight's event is called Ontario is Going to Waste. I prefer to think of this as Killing Landfills 101. That's what I do, and that's what we hope we achieve in some of the cases that we're doing now across Ontario. Now, as David mentioned, I'm a staff lawyer at CELA. I've been there since 1986, and over those 3 or so decades, I've been very busy fighting landfill fights all over the province of Ontario, Southern Ontario, Central Ontario, Northern Ontario, big or small, we fought them all, public and private, little rinky-dink dumps, big mega landfills, the odd incinerator. And I'm not going to revisit all of that. It's not an opportunity tonight to go through memory lane. I just want to focus on 3 landfill cases, one from each decade, and see if we can draw some lessons learned. The first case that I'd like to mention is the Region of Halton landfill case. This is a case that we did at CELA back in the late 1980s. We represented a group called the West Burlington Citizens Association, and they were concerned about a proposal by the region to put a preferred site at a fractured bedrock location. So needless to say, they were concerned about that. It went to a big public hearing, a lengthy public hearing before the joint board, and a decision was made. I'll get to that in a sec. And then it also spun off into some legal challenges at divisional court. So that's what was on tap in the 1980s. The next case, the second case I'd like to mention is the Adams Mine case, which came up in the 1990s. And again, we were involved in that one. You'll recall that that was a proposal to put Toronto trash on a train, send it up to Northern Ontario, up to Kirkland Lake, and put it in a 600-foot deep open pit mine that was already half full of water. I represented an environmental coalition who didn't think that was such a good idea. So that went off to a hearing before the Environmental Assessment Board. It wasn't a full environmental assessment hearing. It was focused on just one issue, and that was the proposed engineering design to see if it was actually going to protect groundwater or not. Again, I think we spent 4 weeks at that hearing, which was kind of funny. It strikes me as odd that we only spent 15 or 20 hearing days talking about an undertaking whose contaminating lifespan was pretty well close to 1,000 years in length. I mean, that's what the proponent admitted. It was going to be about 900 years before the leachate cleaned itself up. And we got to spend 15 days in Kirkland Lake talking about that. Anyways, the hearing was held, and once again, it spun off into some litigation before the divisional court. And that brings me to my third and final case, and that is the proposed expansion of the Richmond landfill site. That occurred in the early 2000s. And in that case, I represented the Concerned Citizens Committee of Tyendinaga and Environs, and we'll be hearing from my good friend and colleague and client, Mike Bossio, shortly about that case. And as you may know, the Richmond landfill was a big landfill proposal. It was an expansion of an existing site. It was subject to environmental assessment. That environmental assessment process lasted about 7 years, from about 1999 to 2006. We didn't get a hearing in that one, but we got a decision, and yes, litigation was pursued as well. And I'm sharing those cases with you tonight, not to go down memory lane. I'm doing it because they all share 3 common factors, and they have 3 common outcomes. In each of the cases, the preferred or proposed site was located in or on fractured bedrock. And in each case, the ultimate decision was not to allow that proposal to go forward due to groundwater contamination concerns. So after 3 decades of those kinds of fights, I now find myself scratching my head and asking why. You know, why are we still fighting landfills at fractured bedrock sites? Why are proponents allowed to propose landfills at fractured bedrock locations? Why can't Ontario just say no up front to those kinds of sites through prohibitions or clear siting rules that just say no to fractured bedrock sites? Because if we don't have that clear upfront direction built into law, that leaves it open to proponents to continually propose new or expanded landfill sites at fractured bedrock locations and other unsuitable sites. And that, in effect, forces all of you and other concerned residents and citizens groups and local communities to spend a lot of time and a lot of money fighting these sites that really shouldn't be proposed in the first place. So those are kind of the, I would say, the public policy questions that need to be answered, and they can only be answered, or they're best answered, in my view, through legislative reform of the landfill approval process. Now, to kickstart that reform process, earlier this summer, CELA and our friends and allies in the Richmond landfill case, we filed an application for review under the Environmental Bill of Rights, which is another environmental law that we have here in Ontario. And the focus of that EBR application was a request to the Ministry of Environment to review and revise the Environmental Protection Act in a way that prohibits new or expanded landfills at fractured bedrock locations. A fairly common sense proposition, I would suggest to you. And I can report that a lot of people in this room, a lot of people on this panel wrote to the ministry in support of our application. A lot of you wrote excellent emails and letters to the ministry, and we thank you for that support. But as most of you know, about a month ago, the ministry wrote back and said no to the application. Basically, the ministry said, not only are we not going to change the law, we're not even going to review the matter. We're not going to publicly or formally review the need to change the law to protect the environment. And the bottom line, if you've had the chance to read the ministry letter, they seem to think that the existing approvals process works well enough. Well, in my view, and based on my experience, the existing process works well if you're a proponent who wants to construct or build a landfill, especially one at a fractured bedrock location. But the existing process doesn't work so well if you're out to protect the public interest and out to protect the environment against the impacts associated with landfilling at sensitive or vulnerable locations. So I just want to report to you about the ministry's refusal to do anything. I can also assure you that we're not going to take no for an answer. The ministry might be content with the status quo, but we're not. And we certainly intend to pursue this matter very vigorously with the Ministry of the Environment, the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, the Ontario Legislature, and anybody else we can think of. And I certainly encourage you all to join us in that very important and I think long overdue law reform campaign. But changing the Environmental Protection Act is not the only thing that needs to be done. I think we need to also look at the Environmental Assessment Act itself. The Environmental Assessment Act still does apply to big landfill proposals, and a lot of us in this room are still immersed in these Byzantine EA processes for landfill proposals. But in my view, the environmental assessment process itself needs some major changes to make it more fair and more effective, more protective of the public interest. And so, for example, we need to see an end to these so-called scoped or focused environmental assessments that don't require landfill proponents to actually prove the need for a landfill. You know, as it goes right now, if they get approval to undertake a scoped or focused landfill EA, they don't have to, you know, justify the project at all. And that's wrong. We need to correct that. We also need to see a return to public hearings under the Environmental Assessment Act. It used to be that if there was any significant concern about potential environmental impacts, you got a hearing. You went off to the Independent Environmental Review Tribunal and had a public hearing, and that's the best place, in my view, for these claims by proponents about site safety. Well, you know, that's where you need to prove them. That's where those claims need to be tested and fully scrutinized by this independent decision maker. So we need to have hearings and not have a lot of this stuff decided behind closed doors by political staff. The other thing I'll mention about the environmental assessment process is the need to reestablish the intervenor funding legislation that the Mike Harris Tories allowed to expire in 1996. If we bring back intervenor funding, that'll certainly make it easier for public interest groups to retain the technical and scientific expertise that's needed to fully and meaningfully participate in the EA process. So those are just some of the EA reforms that CELA intends to pursue with the Ontario government. But again, just fixing the EPA, just fixing the Environmental Assessment Act, that's not enough either. We need to look a little further up the pike. And I think if we're going to do anything to fix the landfill siting process or anything to fix the EA process, we also need to make some changes to ensure some substantial provincial progress in waste reduction, reuse, and recycling. And that's simply because if we can make a real dent in the overall waste stream, if we can minimize the amount of residual waste that might require disposal, then hopefully we would see a corresponding decrease in the number and size and capacity of these mega landfills that proponents keep trying to shove down our throats. So on that point, I would encourage all of you to take a look at Bill 91, which is currently in front of the Ontario Legislature. That's the bill that's entitled Waste Reduction Act. It's the Ontario government's latest attempt to expedite or improve the 3 R's in this province. If you want more detail about it, you can go to our website, CELA.ca. We've written about this brief. We've identified some things that need to be changed or improved. And at some point, probably in the new year, that bill will go to a legislative committee for public hearings. And at that stage, I would encourage everybody in this room to make written submissions to the committee or even request to appear as a witness at these committees. Mostly because I think the MPPs on the committee will need to hear directly from people who are concerned about what happens when you don't get serious about 3Rs, when you let that dawdle or stall, and that leaves the door open for proponents to come forward with these mega landfills at unsuitable sites. So the MPPs need to hear that forcefully from the communities and from individuals who are most impacted by that kind of an approach. So just to let me wrap up, the bottom line is we really do need to get serious on the 3Rs. We need to get really serious with the 3Rs in the industrial and commercial and institutional sector. There's lots of room for improvement there. So I didn't even bring my watch, but I'm sure I'm out of time, so I'm just going to stop right there. I think we can anticipate we'll have a good and fulsome discussion about some of these issues when we have our panel discussion. So with that, let me turn it back over to David.
Thanks very much, Richard. We'll move right into the presentations by the community representatives and briefly introduce them and start with Suzanne down at the far end, research chairperson of the Oxford People Against Landfills.
Thanks. So I'm Suzanne Krellin, research chair, as he said, of the group Oxford People Against the Landfill, and we're better known as the Opal Alliance. And I'd like to thank Candace and the other event organizers for inviting Opal to participate tonight. Our nonprofit citizen volunteer organization was formed in response to a threat that came into our community in March of 2012, and that is the Walker Industries Southwestern Landfill proposal. You can learn more about us online. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and opalalliance.ca. Our situation in Oxford County is somewhat unique in that we have about 75 aggregate pits and quarries operating within our boundaries, and the landfill is proposed to be sited within one of the largest open-faced mines in our county. The Carmoose Lime Quarry is what many would call a mega quarry. The current licensed area is somewhere around 2,300 acres, and it's similar in size to the recently defeated Highland Mega Quarry proposal that some of you may be familiar with. That was the Stop the Quarry campaign. So what we have is about 200 acres, that's the size of about 200 football fields, within this active quarry that they say they're going to be blasting for about 175 more years. Decades of dynamite blasts have further fractured what's already a naturally fractured limestone bedrock environment. And this 200 acres is proposed as the home for about 20 years worth of trash from predominantly the Greater Toronto area. Walker Industries is a private landfill company from around Niagara, and they say they'd be trucking in around 850,000 tons per year of industrial, commercial, institutional, and residential waste, along with additional trucks containing asbestos and contaminated industrial brownfield soil, which they say they'd be using as daily cover soil. If this proposal for a massive landfill for mainly Toronto's garbage is reminding you of the Adams mine dump proposal, you're not alone. Opal has been fortunate to have a key figure from the Adams mine battle as an ally in our fight. Dr. Larry Jensen is a hydrogeologist who helped to prove that putting millions of tons of trash into the Adams mine in Northern Ontario would have put the drinking water for millions of people at risk. As a resident of our county, he knows that the landscape is fractured in this area and concurs with our consultants and our legal team at CELA that Walker's proposal is too risky to be allowed to go forward. The proposed site of the Southwestern landfill sits right on top of the aquifer that provides drinking water for the town of Ingersoll, immediately adjacent to the site, and our closest municipal well is only about 1,000 meters away from the proposed landfill. The Area Source Water Protection Committee has identified it as a high vulnerability aquifer, which is the highest level of vulnerability to contamination, and it's what's called a significant groundwater recharge area as well. The Carmoose Lime Quarry property also has a beautiful quarry lake on it that would likely fall within the landfill's buffer zone. And the site's only about 500 meters from the Thames River, which is deemed a Canadian heritage river. Opal's key concern with the proposal has always been the protection of water for those in Oxford County. We are 100% dependent on ground source water for our drinking water within the county. And there's 104,000 residents that need to drink from that aquifer and connecting aquifers. And the water's also used for our $640 million a year agricultural industry in the county. Recently, we had MP Charlie Angus, known for fighting the Adams mine dump, as the keynote speaker at one of our Opal events. And when he learned we were having trouble getting answers from the landfill company and that they wouldn't allow our hydrogeologist to visit the site, he told us that the groundwater is the key, you're not getting straight answers on the water, and that tells me to be suspicious. A provincial process that puts the landfill proponent at the helm has discouraged the people who live in our communities. Ontario's own Code of Practice for Environmental Assessments tells us the process is proponent-driven, and that's been evident by the amount of work that our committee, OPAL, and all of our volunteers have had to do to engage the public in a process that Walker would rather most of us sit out. Ingersoll and area citizens in the county have learned a lot from the information that OPAL shared with them over the past year and a half, and they continue to come out to key council sessions, protests, and events. They do not want this landfill to crush their towns and potentially devastate our health, our economy, and our environment. The government's already approved a plan for rehabilitating this quarry property. It's all laid out in a site plan approved by the Ministry of Natural Resources. The Aggregate Resources Act says the only way that a site license for a quarry can be surrendered is after progressive and final rehabilitation has been completed. So why are Oxford County residents having to fight a dump for someone else's trash when we've been promised a recreational quality green space on that property? OPAL believes it's time for the Ministry of Natural Resources to enforce existing provincial laws, and we also support the aim of CELA to have Ontario's Environmental Protection Act amended so that landfills are banned within areas that provide no natural protective barriers. We also believe it's time for the province to become progressive about waste management strategies. Landfilling is not sustainable, and we can't keep throwing trash into holes in the ground and expect that it's not going to affect people. We've already seen examples from around the province where leaking landfills have had detrimental consequences. Last week, I was part of a group that accompanied OPAL's chairperson on a visit to Queen's Park, where we witnessed our petition on inappropriate landfill siting being read in the legislature. Our MPP will be reading it again, so if you haven't signed it yet, please consider signing it tonight. It's on the media table over there. At the end of October, OPAL and our allies delivered about 13,000 signed letters to the Ministry of the Environment, asking them to deny approval to the terms of reference for Walker's landfill proposal. We also submitted a 125-page response to the terms of reference prepared by our volunteers, along with expert consultant reports and a hard-hitting legal critique that I would like to thank Richard Lindgren, the keynote speaker here tonight, for preparing on our behalf. It was excellent. And now we wait. The decision from the MOE will be announced next month, and at that time, we'll learn whether we will be devoting thousands more volunteer hours and the donations of our hardworking friends and neighbors to continue this battle for the safety of our communities, or if the government will do the right thing and deny two private companies the chance to risk our drinking water for their own financial gain. Thank you.
Next is Sue Langlois, president of the Capital Region Citizens Coalition for the Protection of the Environment, and you each have 10 minutes, so take your time and
Excellent.
express yourselves as much as you like.
Perfect. Well, welcome, and again, thank you, Candace, and everybody for being here, and each of you for taking care and for caring about our environment. We're new to this fight, so I'm going to take up from what Richard was speaking. I live out in Ottawa, east end of Ottawa, which is where Carlsbad Springs is, and in June of last year, we were thrown into an EA process that had been underway for over a year, so we were thrown partway through. We weren't involved in the original. And that EA process was actually in a different municipality, so not even within the city of Ottawa. And at that point in time, we were identified as a possible site, a second site, for a mega landfill, 460 acres, so playing on project, which is unprecedented in Ottawa area. This was a private landfill project, that is 4 times larger than any of the footprint that we have currently out there today. So we came into the game late into the game, and as it turns out at this point, while we were brought in as a second site, we are now the preferred site, and it is our site, the Carlsbad site that they're looking at. The terms of references were approved by the Ministry of the Environment last year just before Christmas. So here we are, kind of sort of baptism by fire for us out there. So getting into the process late, there was no notice of commencement for us. There was no prior, information, nothing to collect from. There was an open house that was held by the proponents right at the beginning, not in our community, but at an external remote location to inform us of the project. By the way, in the project charter, this is open house and consultation 3, because don't forget, we came into the game late, although this is the first time that we heard about the project. Equally is, while they had prepared a draft TOR for the first site for the other municipality, by the way, which I should point out is completely different situation, completely different geology than what we have in our area, completely different cities, we didn't have the benefit of a draft. So it's not like we could even have an opportunity to review details or even know what was coming our way. So we were identified to this project in June. The full TOR was released to us in the fall, that same fall, 3 months later. So we had a 3-month window to get collected, to pull everything together, to find out what this was all about so that we could participate in the public review of the TOR. By the way, our TOR was 5,000 pages, and we had to sit there, divide it, and conquer it, and go through it. Okay, it's obvious that this project is being fast-tracked at this point in time. The other thing that we have that's unique to our community is we do have a 50% Francophone base in our area, and the TOR, which defines the studies and plays the rules of the game, were not provided in French, nor was any documentation provided in French. So notwithstanding that we were at disadvantage to start off with in trying to sort through all of this, half of our residents couldn't even read the material in their language of preferred choice and what they were most comfortable in. The other thing is there is a government review team that goes through this, that provides input, various government agencies, expert matters that go through this, that look at this. The government review team had been given the draft TOR, which was for the other site, not for our site. And we're not even sure at this point in time whether they did see the final TOR, which is really for the Carlsbad site, the second site that came into it. And the reason that we say that is there were a couple of agencies that we contacted, major agencies, federal agencies in the Ottawa area, who hadn't heard about it, didn't know about it. We informed them that they needed to get this and to respond to this. So I guess one of the questions that our community has at this point in time is, how is it that a proponent can choose an initial site, then partway through the process simply add another site in a completely different city with completely different geology, with completely different makeup, and have this done under the same TOR? This really is the second site and should have been a second process through all of this. The other thing that we are finding at this point in time is, notwithstanding the process and what's going on, is the proponent continuously misrepresents their project today as primarily a recycling and recovery center. So if you take a look at the flyers and the glossies, it's all about recycling and promoting and doing the best. The one thing they forget to mention, or mention very little, is the proposed mega landfill that comes along with this recycling center. In our particular case, what the proponent has stated is 87%, they're going to recycle 12% of the waste coming in. 87% is going to be landfilled. They can only state to the provincial norms at this point. Their intent is to do more, but at this point in time, they can't make any assurances or show us any plans. So while they extol the virtues of this recycling center, none of us here have a problem with recycling. In this particular case, 87% is going to be landfilled. So landfill should be the biggest part of their project. The other item is, for those of you who saw Harold's report, or maybe not, we've been doing number crunching and came up with the same thing. In this particular case, this 460-acre mega landfill was approved for a scope DA, which means they do not have to prove need. If we take a look at the IC&I, or the industrial and commercial waste in the City of Ottawa today, according to the MOE figures, we in the City of Ottawa generate 457,000 metric tons of IC&I waste per year that we have to landfill. That's taking out the 12% that gets recycled. We currently have capacity for 817,750 tons. So we have the capacity that we need. With the Carp Road EA approval that is going through, or process that is going through, and the Carlsbad Spring proposal that is on the table today, we're going to have double that capacity, which is already double of what we need. So the question that we have is, where is this garbage coming from? This is not for the Ottawa region and our area. And don't forget, the certificates of approval and stuff like that, while you try to mitigate it and you say, take it from, and the proponent will say, it is for the Ottawa area, primarily for the capital region, it isn't. On their maps, it goes down to Belleville and for the province, so if you read between the lines. So we're wondering why, for a mega landfill and something this enormous and this serious, was a Scope DA allowed to go through? Why were they allowed to bypass all of that? These concerns were brought to the proponent and to the Ministry of the Environment, but they were ignored. Even the comments from the City of Ottawa were ignored. The terms of reference were passed without any kind of translation, without adequate consultation from what we feel in our community, and over the loud objections of our community in the City of Ottawa, who know the site is not suitable. Our campaign is called Dump This, Dump Too, primarily because we are a second site that was added to this TOR, but this is the second time we fight a landfill for this proposed location. So how we know the site isn't right is, in the 1980s, this exact site was thoroughly investigated by the municipality of Ottawa-Carleton for a landfill. It was studied for 6 years before the project was finally dropped, because a landfill, we are in a very heavy Leda clay base, 100 feet deep, so the landfill would take at least 4 times as much area on that site than any other site. So they can't pile it high, so they have to take more land. So completely irresponsible land use at this case. The soil is so soft, as a matter of fact, that the Boundary Road overpass that runs boundary over the 417 had to be redesigned to stand on piers 100 feet deep into the bedrock to prevent it from sinking. The site floods semi-annually, semi-regularly, because the water table is at the surface. There is sand layers on the top surface, as well as sand layers that go through the various lower levels. And these sand layers continue off the property, and they're the aquifers supplying our local shallow wells. In addition to that is the soil at the site is classed as the most vulnerable or at risk during a seismic events, which will be increased shaking, so it's like the Jello effect. We've also seen reports over the last year where the Leda clay has liquefied. That's the properties, the soil conditions that we have there. So it's not a slight Leda clay, it's 100 feet deep of Leda clay that you have there. And we are also known in our area as an area of high seismic risk. So what we are asking is studies need to take this into account. As part of the EA, as part of the studies that are being done, we're saying this has to be studied. It's a real risk in our area, and we need to know how things have to be dealt with according in that. And so because of this, the above had been fairly considered in the early phases of the municipal site selection process, and what the city realized, or the regional municipality realized, would have resulted in serious financial consequences, according to a summary report that was provided, which is why the project was shut down or abandoned at that point in time. So this is the second time. We have taken every opportunity to tell the proponent and the ministry that the project cannot proceed at this site, but so far no one is listening, and that is unacceptable. Hydrogeologically unsuitable sites like this must be excluded from waste disposal proposals once they have been identified. Communities like ours should not have to refight expensive common sense battles we have already won. So Carlsbad and the City of Ottawa is not willing to host this project, and as Richard said, the province of Ontario has to have a strategy, a long-term strategy to do with this landfill. It's not just because you're a private individual or a private company with money that should give you the right to build one of these mega landfills. Thank you.
Next up is Harry Baker. He's the president of Citizens Environmental Stewardship Association east of Ottawa.
Thank you very much, David. Feel like I'm the other man in the relationship here. Because,
we are partners, though.
We're partners. We were the first municipality that was going to be the site of the first site, and then Carlsbad was the second site. So we're from Russell Township, and our campaign is called Dump the Dump Now. Dump the Dump. This Dump Too is our partner, and one of the things that we did is when they the company, Taggart Miller, decided to go with the second site is we came alongside the group in Carlsbad to provide them with the expertise that we had. We had been working for about 2 years at that point when they came on board, and so we were able to give them some assistance.
Yes, you did.
And,
Lots.
provide them some background to what we had done and where we saw it going. I'm an engineer, and I don't think there's too many probably engineers in the room, but one of the things that to deal with landfills is that the ministry believes that an engineering solution is possible. And the engineering solution is to use liners, sometimes 2 liners, sometimes using leachate collection systems to try to remove any leachate that might leak through the liners. The fact is, all liners leak. The designers of these liners admit that. The biggest difficulty with liners isn't the fact that they can't make proper materials, it's they can't join them together. So these are big, long rolls of high-density polyethylene. They roll out, and then they have to weld them in the field. Not an easy thing to do, and so we're talking about miles and miles and miles of these joints that have to be done in the field. And so eventually, if not right from the initial go, these things already have holes in them and will leak. And as Sue Crellin was saying earlier, is that what we need to do is to rely on the natural protective barriers that are there already to be the last line of defense for preventing groundwater to be polluted or leachate flowing off the site. And so that's something that we looked at early on. We have a science group, and Dr. Joe Wallach, who's a structural geologist, we got together and we went through all the design guidelines that MOE has for landfills, and we critiqued them and wrote to the minister and said, we think you need to revise and have better detailed geological and hydrogeological investigations. And we want you to look at not just on the site, but we want you to look off the site. For some reason, the water doesn't know to stop at the fence line. It just wants to keep going. And so there's no use just looking on the site. You got to look off the site. And the other thing you got to do is look at these fractures, and if there's fractures there, where do they lead? And just think about it. If there was fractured rock and there's water starting to go, how would you ever mitigate against that? How would you put cement there? What would you try to do to stop those areas from leaking? They have wells around the perimeter of the property, and they're going to see some leachate movement on those, but when you got fractures, it's going to move real quickly, and you can't have a hole at every one of those fractures to see how it's going, eh? Anyway, so we got a hold of them and said, look, MOE, you've got to revise your regulations and your design guidelines. And they said no, just like Richard was saying. They said, no, it's quite adequate. These were done in 2010. The best engineers looked at this, and we think that we've got the sort of Cadillac design guidelines for North America, and they refused. We also went to the Environmental Commissioner's office, and initially we didn't think that they really listened to us, but a year later in their annual report, they happened to agree with our request to MOE and disagreed with the minister. And so we were kind of happy with that. They make a report to the Ontario Legislative Assembly. So now it's up to the MPPs to take that and to push for something to be done. Most of their reports and recommendations, very little is ever done. So there's an area there. They've got a group, this Environmental Commissioner's Office, which is sort of like an ombudsman maybe for the environment, but really, I have to say, very little effect based on their recommendations that you see anything done. We were very pleased to sign the CELA petition that Napanee, along with Napanee and Opal, to go against the idea of putting landfills on fractured rock or other hydrogeologically unsuitable locations. And our point is basically that when the engineered liners fail, it's the natural site conditions that will be the last barrier defense against polluting the surface water and surrounding groundwater environments. we live in eastern Ontario, and those of you that live here know that we have seismic events called earthquakes. And these earthquakes occur along faults. Faults are a type of fracture where there's movement. And these faults called vibrations. And you probably know that there was one in, Val-de-Mont in June 2010, and there were chimneys fell, steeples fell, stuff came off of store shelves and stuff. That was about a 5, magnitude 5. We could probably get a 6 or a 7 in this area. Much stronger shaking. And those shaking can cause two things. They can cause movement underneath of the liner and all the stuff in the liners and all the buildings that are on the site, but also potential liquefaction in the area that Sue was talking about in Carlsbad, where they have this thick lead of clay that's very weak. And so one of the things that we would like to have in their regulations and their guidelines is to look at these faults, to look at movements on these faults, but also to look at what the seismic risk is at those sites. There's nothing in these designs that look at seismic risk. The Geological Survey of Canada has produced for the Ottawa area a seismic hazard map related to terrain type. And this shows that the place where we were talking about on Boundary Road in Carlsbad, that it's probably the highest risk area for seismic movement and potential liquefaction in the Ottawa area. So who's looking at that? Who's taking that into consideration? Doesn't seem to be the MOE. So we're concerned about risk of future seismic events at landfill sites in this region, but all over Ontario. This isn't just eastern Ontario. There are seismic events in other parts of Ontario as well. We're going to go to Toronto on Thursday to meet the minister. I believe you guys were there before. Is it that? Who?
We were.
You were there. So CARP was there, and then there was another group last week? Or you were last week?
No, we were last week.
You were with the deputy minister? So they're starting to listen to our groups. They're starting to entertain people to come to Queen's Park and talk to them about our concerns. We're going to meet the minister. We're going to meet some of the deputy ministers, and we're going to meet some people from the Ministry of Northern Affairs and Mines, and also the Natural Resources Group. Because the first site that was proposed for this landfill was at a quarry, just like you have down in Ingersoll. And our concern was that here's a quarry that is a beautiful lake and a great place for the wildlife to come. And we were concerned about it being polluted, and we were concerned about what the implications were in the area around that. The last thing I wanted to say is that it's our impression that when technical comments are sent to the Ministry of the Environment, these comments are basically just passed on to the proponent. The Ministry of the Environment does not review them, does not pass them to other experts in the government review team, because there are other departments that are asked to comment on things like terms of reference and the environmental assessments and things. But these things don't seem to be passed on. That's our impression. And so it looks like if you hire an expert like this Mr. Moore here, and he writes a report and you send it in, it just goes into a black hole there. It's passed on to the proponent. The proponent says, yeah, he's interested in the geology site. We're looking at that. There it is in our TOR, chapter 6.1. We're looking at that, and these are, so we're concerned that either they don't have the expertise, or if they do, why aren't they sharing their responses back to us? Why does it seem to be a black hole there? And if they don't have the expertise, why don't they have the expertise? Because we're expecting them to be the regulator and to look after the environment, to protect the environment. And that's why we're going on Thursday, whether we will get anywhere in sharing our concerns, but at least we have the opportunity to speak to Mr. Bradley, the minister, and to some of the other higher officials. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you. Next is Harold Moore, a founding member of Don't Let Ottawa Go to Waste.
Thank you very much. Again, I'd like to thank Candace and everybody who's coming out. This is the first chance we've all got together. We've probably all felt like we've been fighting a fight on our own, and it's good to get together and be able to share stories. I'm not sure if you've noticed the progression here, but we're going along in expertise or weariness, one or the other. Our fight has been for 8 years now, and it started off with a very poorly advertised single meeting out in a rural area for the terms of reference. And about 120 people showed up. And they were trying to squeak that terms of reference in with very little community input. But the cat got out of the bag, and the community organized its own meeting a couple of weeks later, and there was 1,200 people in a small school gym. In fact, they were out the door. We don't know how far out the door they went. So that's just one of the games the proponents play. They try to push things through as quietly as they can. Our proposal is in West Carleton, is on the west side of Ottawa. There is an existing landfill on the site, which is now closed as of 2011. And the proponent is proposing a brand new landfill to the north of it. The proponent is Waste Management of Canada, and I guess I'll give a little history about the old landfill and the site, because it's very pertinent to the proposal. The old landfill, the two major concerns of the old site were odor and groundwater, and a third one is proximity to the urban boundary of Ottawa. The odor issue was one of major problems back in, from about 2004 on until when they closed the site. And the proponent was not recording any complaints. The ministry was not recording complaints, so the community took upon itself to set up a website where complaints could be put on the web page and automatically sent to the MOE and the ministry, the MOE and the proponent. The worst year was 2007, when we got over 5,000 complaints on odor, and in total there was over 7,500 complaints were put in. That made the ministry kind of take notice, and they said, "Oh, I guess you have an odor problem." And actually the ministry started to do an investigation. They were actually going to charge Waste Management for breach of environmental law and committing odor offenses on the community. They actually hired an investigator who was investigating, and we felt that we were going to be vindicated, and this troublemaker was going to be taken to court and actually had to stand up and admit to his the problems he was causing in the community. Unfortunately, MOE backed down. They looked at the report from the inspector, and they basically said, "I don't think we can win in court, so we'll slap Waste Management on the wrist, we'll tell them do better," and that's all that happened. So, in the meantime, in 2007, they went ahead and, even though with all this odor going on, they went ahead and approved a certificate of approval for air emissions, because Waste Management was planning to do some work on the site. And part of that approval was modeling, which showed that there would be no odor emissions from the site, even though there was 5,000 people complaining about odors. So we appealed to the Environmental Review Tribunal on that case, and we won leave to appeal. The Environmental Review Tribunal agreed with us that the modeling that was being used by the proponent to prove that there was no odor was totally flawed, just by reality that there were odors. And based on that, we went into mediation with the proponent, and we got a fair amount of concessions from them, and one of the concessions was that they would close the site by 2011, even though they wanted to keep going until 2014. So the reason it's closed now is because of the community's efforts. The other issue that is of concern is the groundwater issue. The site is on an old sand and gravel. It's on an esker. It's an old sand and gravel pit area. and the sand and gravel sits on top of fractured limestone, the very same fractured limestone that is down in Napanee. The site, the existing site, is leaking off-site. The proponent has had to purchase nearly 50 hectares of off-site property because of contamination. They are being monitored by the MOE. And again, the problem with MOE seems to be they don't want to use the teeth they have. The community was concerned that the actual boundary of the leachate plume isn't well defined. How far it goes isn't well defined, and we asked MOE to have further wells, monitoring wells drilled so that we would know exactly how far it went. MOE asked the proponent to provide some more wells farther out, and the proponent came back and said, well, no, we can't do that because, and they had a bunch of reasons why they couldn't do it, and MOE basically accepted the proponent's rationale. 2 years after that, the MOE finally started to realize that there wasn't a good handle on how far the leachate was going, and they finally did get the proponent to drill new wells. But to me, the MOE does not use the power it has as a regulator, whether it doesn't want to get confrontational with large proponents, I'm not sure, but they didn't want to, they didn't use the regulatory abilities to enforce, to actually understand where the groundwater issues are going. We, because of the community uprising in 2006, the proponent pulled back his terms of reference, went back to the drawing boards and made a few modifications and came back again with a revised terms of reference. And the community spent a lot of time and effort putting together a huge document that had a lot of comments about the terms of reference that the proponent wasn't addressing. And a lot of them have been talked about here right now. One of them, it was a scope DA, so there was no rationale or defined need. And once again, they pulled back their terms of reference and they sat on it for a while until they came back in 2010. And this is one issue I have with it. As a community, there's only so much time that the community can contribute to fighting it. And yet the proponent has all the flexibility in the world to keep going back and pulling back until the timing is right, or until they've worn down the community to the point that there's no fight left or there's no financial resources left. And to me, again, that's a deficiency in the whole process. The proponent, if they want to go ahead with their project, they should have to go ahead. They shouldn't have this ability to keep the community on tenterhooks. Needless to say, the terms of reference were approved. As I said, we had a huge document outlining all kinds of concerns and deficiencies in the terms of reference. Basically, the terms of reference were rubber stamped by MOE, and we were told that you raised a whole lot of good points, but don't worry, they will be addressed in the environmental assessment. We, unfortunately, not being experts at the game, we are now. We wouldn't have taken that answer, but we took it as an answer that that's the process, and we have to go along with it. Unfortunately, a lot of those issues were not addressed in the environmental assessment. The proponent said, don't worry, we'll look after them in the environmental compliance approval process. And we didn't really like that, but there's nothing you can do to challenge the minister's approval. And then, unfortunately, after the approval was done, we heard from Rick that the way it works is that we don't really have any right to appeal following an environmental approval by the minister. So we really don't have a chance now to comment and challenge anything in the environmental compliance approval process. So this whole process of pushing things down the road until it's reached a point that the issue is a done deal. There's nothing you can do. The one thing that bothers me with MOE is this business of it, the environmental assessment being proponent-driven. You go to the open houses, you talk to the proponent, you complain about problems, you bring up concerns. They don't listen to you. They just push on with their process. You talk to the MOE saying that we're not getting anywhere with the proponent. MOE says, no, it's a proponent-driven. Go back to talk to the proponent. And yet, the ministry won't come and talk to the community. They will come down. In fact, they did come down and they talked to the proponent. They had a site visit. They talked to him. We invited the ministry to come down and sit down with us, talk to us face to face. They said, no, we can't do that. So it's not fair. And I guess before I close, to me, in this whole process, there are two primary stakeholders. One is the proponent who wants the project, who's driven by profit, who's driven by the bottom line, who's driven by stakeholders or stockholders. The other major stakeholder is the community around the proposal. They are driven by the community they live in. They don't want it destroyed. They're concerned about health. They're concerned about safety. They're concerned about cost of living and property values and things like that. Those two stakeholders should have equal weighting in the whole process because they both have the same amount at stake. Maybe even the community has more because they're not going anywhere. That's where they're living. And yet the whole system is geared towards the proponent. The MOE will not listen, as Harry said, they will not listen to the community, even though we may have the credentials and living there. Basically, that local knowledge is much more important than what the consultants who often come from far and wide don't know anything about. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, and we can maybe, if there's questions after, we can get into it. But the whole process is very flawed. It's not fair. It's set up for the proponent, and I think when Rick said that the MOE didn't want to review the Bill of Rights or the Environmental Protection Act, and they said, don't worry, the existing approvals process will take care of it. They approved our environmental assessment, and yet we're on fractured limestone that's leaking, has been leaking for the last 20 years. And so there is something wrong with the approvals process, and it needs to be changed in legislation.
The last presentation's from Mike Bossio, Chairperson of Concerned Citizens Committee of Tyendinaga and Environ.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Candace, for inviting us here. Sitting here, just listening to all these stories, I'm going, man, yeah, okay, tick that one off, tick that one off, tick that one off. We've seen it all, and again, and again, and again. So, my name is Mike Bossio. I'm with the Concerned Citizens Committee of Tyendinaga and Environs. And we have been fighting first the Richmond Landfill expansion and now the Beechwood Road Environmental Center. There seems to be a common theme here around this whole recycling, get-ups, greenify it. That way anybody who goes along with it can sleep at night. I'll give you a kind of lay of the land here. The red dot is where the site is today. The pink outline spot is the Greater Napanee. The blue spot is Tyendinaga Township. The spot below that running down to the Bay of Quinte is the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, and the little green spot over here is Deseronto. This blue piece of waterway here is the Beechwood, Marysville Creek, and the headwaters of the Marysville Creek are here on the site. The salmon, which flows into the Bay of Quinte, the Salmon River is just north of it, flows into the Bay of Quinte, and Sucker Creek, also just south of it, flows into the Bay of Quinte. The leachate right now emanating from the old leaking dump site is all leaking into these waterways, leaking through the groundwater into the Bay of Quinte. The Bay of Quinte, I hope everybody could hear that before. I have a pretty loud voice, so. The Bay of Quinte has been on a UN watch list since the 1980s, one of the most polluted bodies of water in the world. And here we constantly have these landfill sites that are located so close. I mean, that's only 6 kilometers from the Bay of Quinte, and it is polluting the Bay of Quinte today. And yet they propose building a one 4 times the size right next to it. The neighbors in the surrounding communities on that map are all on wells. We don't have any municipal water source, so everybody relies on wells for their water, like the Opal Alliance, farms, residences, etc. The rest of that, I'm not going to go over everything because a lot of the stuff is being repeated from earlier. I'll give you a bit of a history on the landfill. The site was first opened in 1954 basically it was a burn pit. In 1986, the first expansion approval was made for 125,000 tons of waste from all over Ontario. In the 1990s, Waste Management, the world's largest waste company, purchased the site. In 1999, they put forward their first Richmond expansion proposal for 750,000 tons of waste and 250,000 tons of contaminated soil to be used as cover. We fought, as Richard had mentioned, thankfully Richard joined us at that moment in 1999 and has been with us ever since. In 2006, as he had mentioned, the minister, Laurel Broughton, had rejected the expansion proposal, citing that there are significant environmental risks associated with expanding the landfill. For the next 4 years, we were fighting to close the Richmond landfill, which was supposed to be closed in 2003. Once again, a similar story that you've heard from so many others where delay, delay, delay. Stop taking garbage, and we'll delay it as long as possible. In 2008, the Environmental Commission of Ontario said that this is arguably one of the worst sites in Ontario to locate a landfill, and it should be closed immediately. He said the vertical and horizontal fractures in the limestone are like water traveling through a pipe. They go great distances in a very short period of time. So Waste Management in 2010 turns around and announces another terms of reference for another expansion proposal. It is the first time, from what we know, in Ontario's history where a company has lost an environmental assessment on a site and come back with virtually the same proposal in the same location utilizing the same technology. The MOE the next day issued a certificate of approval to close the existing landfill, and in 2011 the landfill was closed. Sorry, I guess I got ahead of myself there. So continuing on in 2012, the MOE approved the environmental monitoring plan for the closed landfill. And then they turned around and they approved the terms of reference for the new expanded environmental assessment for the new expanded landfill, the Breck. So once again, against all logic, here we go again. A small community against the world's largest waste company. Because the environmental monitoring plan was so totally flawed, our hydrogeologist, and this once again will be reminiscent of what you've already heard, our hydrogeologist had 17 recommendations for the environmental monitoring plan. Every single one of them were completely ignored. We never got one response back from Waste Management or the MOE. So we asked for leave to appeal to the Environmental Review Tribunal. And the Review Tribunal granted us leave to appeal. And in that leave to appeal, they said no one of sound mind would have given this approval to this environmental monitoring plan, speaking of the Director of Approvals for the MOE. So the Bay of Quinte, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte have been our brethrens in this fight right from the beginning, and they continue to be through this new process and with the Environmental Review Tribunal. We've been undergoing negotiations since that time for over a year now with Waste Management and the MOE in the citizens, so we thought, okay, this is ridiculous. How can you keep going on this way? So we thought, well, what can we do to try to get the MOE to wake up and realize the errors of their ways? So we put forward this Environmental Bill of Rights application to have 2 changes made to the Environmental Act, to review the Environmental Act, to prohibit the siting of landfills on environmentally unsuitable locations, and repeat applications where similar proposals have been previously declined. Unfortunately, a few months later, the MOE denied our request to have the act reviewed. So where does that leave us? Let me make this very clear, and as you can hear from everyone else at this table, this is not a NIMBY issue. This is an issue where local municipalities, provincial politicians, the Environmental Commission of Ontario, all of our 27 local doctors have signed 2 petitions, and many, many experts and thousands of thousands, tens of thousands of dollars have gone into hiring those experts, have all agreed that this site is unsuitable for landfilling because of the vertically and horizontally fractured limestone. You've got very little or no soil. And the whole region is considered a vulnerable aquifer, as you'd heard in Suzanne's case as well. There are many areas. Fractured limestone is a vulnerable aquifer. It doesn't matter where you go. But our whole region has been classified by the province as a vulnerable aquifer. There are a number of reasons why we put forward this EBR application and the request to reject the EA. But the MOE rejected our EBR, saying that the process works. But we say works for who? Imagine how we felt as a community when that terms of reference was approved for a second time. We fought the good fight. We followed the process, as everyone said you need to follow. We won fair and square, but yet here we are again, fighting another unnecessary fight on fractured limestone. It's insanity. But you have large corporations like Waste Management with very deep pockets that manipulate the legislation and move forward with applications that are virtually the same in the same location, and they can get away with it because they've got deep enough pockets to do so. No other reason. There's no other justification for it. They are manipulating a flaw within the process, within the legislation. If the legislation was strong enough, why are we today in an ERT process and another environmental assessment fight? We had to take Waste Management to the Environmental Review Tribunal to demand proper monitoring of this site that could have and should have happened years ago, right? And so what is this process revealed about this site? The landfill is massively leaking despite years of denial from Waste Management. Fragile aquifers are polluted with highly toxic chemicals. Waste Management is not in compliance with their environmental compliance approval. Carcinogens are found in off-site wells, including residential wells. And Waste Management has been unable to determine the extent of the leaks. Every single well that they have drilled in the contaminant attenuation zone so far is contaminated. Every single one of them. So we find ourselves now in a contingency situation. For years, we were saying to Waste Management, what is your contingency plan? What are your big plans, right? When we finally hold your feet to the fire and you have to admit that this thing is leaking off-site. Oh, we've got lots of them. Well, what are they? Oh, well, we can't tell you that. You'll have to wait until the process comes. So after we finally end up in this contingency situation, their only contingency plan is a contaminant attenuation zone. That means that they plan to let this site contaminate the groundwater, the Bay of Quinte, and people's wells for hundreds of years. They have no way to contain it. They have no way to remediate it, right? They've admitted as much, and the only proposal they put so far is a CAS. And now they want to build a site 4 times the size right next door to the leaking old site. And as it was mentioned earlier, and the whole plan rests on this liner system. Every liner built leaks, right? So if you're going to build a landfill, you don't build it on fractured lino, where our community is going to have to deal with further fallout for hundreds of more years. You use Mother Nature, right? You build sites where Mother Nature can act to contain, remediate, or for natural attenuation. So what do we know about the site's characteristics, right? Highly fractured bedrock, groundwater flow is not understood, it's difficult to monitor, it's leaking uncontrollably, and it's difficult to impossible to remediate. So in conclusion, we have the legacy of one leaking dump that Waste Management have no solution to fix. It's not right that we should carry the burden of another leaking dump nearly 4 times the size that will eventually further contaminate our community for hundreds of years. Richmond is the perfect example as to why the BREC is a bad idea and why the EBR application was put forward. A flawed process and flawed legislation of why we are where we are today. If we leave the legislation as it is, that will allow deep-pocketed corporations to manipulate and abuse the weaknesses in the legislation, and small communities like ours suffer the consequences. When Minister Jim Bradley was last in this role in the 1980s, mid-1980s, he made a lot of positive legislative changes to the Environmental Act and is touted as one of the better Ministers of the Environment that our province has ever had. We are hopeful that being back in this role, he will finish what he started. Maybe he'll call it JB2. But Minister Bradley has the opportunity to do the right thing, to cement his legacy as the best Minister of the Ministry of Environment that this province has ever had, by making changes to the legislation so that other communities will not have to unnecessarily go through what our community has gone through for the last 15, if actually since 86 people have been fighting this for 25 years. After 15 years, we would like to stand down from our apparently essential role as the watchdogs for this entire situation. Leaky land is still a bad place to have a dump. Thank you.
Well, we do have half an hour, and on the agenda it says panel discussion. But I think what might be most useful would be to fold that panel discussion into a question and answer period, and of course all the panelists responding and commenting as members of the audience as well. So if that's all right with everybody, can we proceed with just a question and answer session?
I'm a citizen, and I live in Oxford County, and it's become apparent that the MOE is not going to protect us. And I just wondered, all the groups joining together now, I just wondered, what do you see as the next step in terms of trying to unify? You all have the same story, you all had the same experience. Do you have ideas what you want to do together as a group to try and stop this?
Anybody like to take that among the panelists?
Or someone else? Okay. Well, I mean, you know, we thought for so long that we were alone in this, and it's unfortunate that we're no longer alone, that there are so many other communities are suffering from this as well. It's imperative that we join forces and put as much pressure as we possibly can, political pressure as we possibly can on the minister with our MPs. We need to get petitions signed. We need to have letters written. We need to get out in front of the public, just as we are tonight. It's not enough just to have a social networking presence. You've got to be out in front of the public making presentations. You've got to get the public engaged. If we do not get the public engaged, then we won't win this fight. That's one of the big lessons we learned in the last round when we did win, is that you have to have public engagement. And now that we have so many communities that are spread out that have very similar issues, well, identical issues around fractured limestone, I think that as a combined effort, we can put far greater pressure on the province than we ever have to say, look, it's not just one seat you're worried about anymore. You've got 4, 5, 6, 7 seats that are now up for grabs in the next election. But the only way we're going to do that is if they see that there is strong public support against building landfills on fractured limestone. And once again, not as a NIMBY issue, right? This is a real issue. This is not a NIMBY issue. And I think that the public and the politicians have to be made aware of that. And each one of us, it's incumbent upon us to get out in front of the community in our respective communities and make sure that we build that momentum moving forward, because that's the only way we're going to do this. And then eventually get an MPP, hopefully, to put forward a private members bill. Maybe we'll get lucky and Jim Bradley will do it. But that's how we get there, is we have to put forward a bill, because the MOE is not going to do it for us. You're right, they're not.
The only thing I was going to say was one word: coalition. We need to bring together all the groups in the province that are in the same situation we are. We need to share best practices and information, but we also need to get together and be politically active.
I just want to add quickly to that. I agree that the coalition is what's needed. I'm not so sure it's going to be a hard political push. In our case, the City of Ottawa had a number of concerns with the environmental assessment. The mayor of the City of Ottawa, the second largest city in Ontario, went and visited Mr. Bradley directly and presented the concerns on the table. Not one of them was addressed in the improved environmental assessment. So political pressure is what's needed, but it's going to be a lot of pressure that's needed.
All right, so it sounds like the tail you have to twist is a political one, and that's the whole game, really. Is there any role, if I can just ask a follow-up, just federally, is there any benefit to try and get a federal involvement in it? Does it slow up the process for other companies that are trying to do this, or?
Actually, can I just add one thing to the previous question as well? Don't completely write off the MOE. You can't do that, right? You have to meet with as many people as you can, as often as you can, to find advocates, right? Because those advocates inside, if you can get enough momentum as well amongst those advocates, there's a lot of people that are going to be against it, and they will never come out to your face and tell you that they're your advocate. So you're not going to know who that is, and that's why it's imperative to get in front of them and talk to them and put a human face on this issue, because they're like a doctor. They look at it and they say, oh, it's NIMBY issue, or it's, oh, technically we can do this. Science has proven it can work. No. You have to put a human face on it and say, no, there are real people involved in this. Thank you. Sorry. I just wanted to add that.
Richard?
Oh, yes. I heard the question about whether there might be some federal angles that we might be able to use to our advantage. And that would have been a really good question 2 or 3 years ago, because that's when we actually had the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act in all its glory. And in fact, we did use it to some extent at the Richmond landfill situation at the time that the provincial EA was going through the first time. Prior to 2006, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte had also petitioned the federal environment minister to apply the Federal Environmental Assessment Act to this proposal on the grounds it was going to adversely affect First Nation interests and lands. Fortunately, the provincial EA was rejected by the Minister of the Environment, Laurel Broughton, and that sort of put an end to using the federal process, because there's no longer a landfill to deal with. Fast forward to today, some of you may know that the Stephen Harper majority repealed the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act and replaced it with a much more watered down, much less effective piece of legislation that really doesn't apply to landfills. It applies to big things, potentially like nuclear plants and radioactive waste dumps, and I do those cases too. But for the most part, this is a provincial matter. So unless you have a proponent that's stupid enough to somehow inadvertently trigger federal jurisdiction, by trying to nuke fish habitat or do something else to that effect, there's really not much we can do federally. It's really a provincial/municipal fight.
All right, thank you.
I'd like to address Richard, if I may, because of your long experience with the... Oh, sorry, Jerry Augusta. I'm associated with the CARP landfill issue. Richard, the Ontario Environmental Assessment Act used to be good. And over the years, and I'm sure I'd like you to explain where it fell apart. At what time, public interest was important.
2 words, Mike Harris, go ahead.
Community interest was critical, as well as all of the environmental attributes that go with that and the socioeconomic. For us, during the terms of reference, during the EA process, environment seems to be the issue. We've whittled it down to groundwater, air, fugitive emissions, and little or no concern for the community, for any Ontario land use planning that's gone on, in our case the Carp Road Corridor Development Plan, and even no recognition of the Ottawa official plan, which deals with and has us as an expanding community with brand new homes springing up within a kilometre of this proposal. When did that fall apart, and how do we fix that?
Fell apart in 1996 when Ontarians elected Mike Harris and his cronies to Queen's Park. And I'm not being partisan, that's just what happened. And one of the first things that happened under Mike Harris's watch was a sweeping rewrite of the Ontario Environmental Assessment Act. Prior to that time, as was just pointed out, it was regarded as a fairly rigorous, fairly effective, fairly participatory process that communities could use and did use to help stop or slow down some of these unsustainable projects. I was fortunate enough when I joined CELA in the mid-'80s, that was the heyday of environmental assessment. It was a good process, and as I mentioned earlier, if there was any concern about unresolved environmental impacts or social economic impacts, you got a hearing before an independent tribunal. Evidence was put before the tribunal under oath. You got to cross-examine, you got to present competing expert evidence, and then this independent, non-political decision maker made the final call. That's the way it should be. But I think that whole process scared some people because sometimes the answer was no. And I mentioned the Region of Halton hearing. It was a long, expensive hearing that resulted in a no to the preferred site. And so there was always some concern among less enlightened proponents that, you know, the EA process is too long, too unpredictable, too expensive, and we might get turned down. So Mike Harris, you better get in there and fix it. So that's what they did. 1996, passed Bill 76, which basically gutted the act, put into place for the first time the terms of reference mechanism. That didn't exist before, but it was put in place in 1996 to allow proponents to shape, scope, focus down an EA. So instead of doing everything, you're just doing little snippets of the puzzle. So to fix that, I think, you know, I wouldn't advocate a return to these long hearings. Nobody benefits from a long hearing, especially in the absence of participant funding. Nobody could afford to do that. Can you imagine doing a 180-day hearing with no intervener funding? It's unbelievable. But I think we could fix EA without having to have 180-day hearings. I think we need to go back to what we had, bring some of it forward, update it. I think Dave mentioned in his little intro of me, there was passing reference to the Minister's Task Force on Environmental Assessment. That was a process that was set up in 2005 by the Liberal Minister Leona Dombrowski. Some of you may remember her. And I think that process was set up partially in response to a decade's worth of concern about the adverse impacts caused by the Harris reforms to the Act. And so all of a sudden, you know, proponents were happy because they're whipping through the process. There's no hearings. Everybody's getting an approval. Everything's great. But affected communities and individuals and farmers and First Nations say, hey, process, what process? There's no process now, so we need to swing the pendulum back. So it was that kind of backdrop or context that prompted the Environment Ministers to set up an expert panel of EA practitioners to come up with a game plan for bringing it back, adding some balance, making the process more effective. I was fortunate enough to be on that panel along with other EA practitioners, and in 2005, 2006, we came up with a very detailed set of recommendations, about 41 recommendations on how to fix the process. And the minister, I think we gave her more than she anticipated. and the minister thanked us very profusely for our report and implemented, I think, one recommendation. The other 40 are on the shelf. So one of the things I want to do between now and the end of this year is to put the ministry on notice again that, you know, those recommendations for reform have not been acted upon. You've never even answered them. You never even said why you're not going to do it. So basically, I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag in terms of what we're going to do, but we're going to use that pre-existing EA report, the minister's own task force report, and say, look, this is what needs to be done. You need to do it. So that's going to be a long-term process. Sometimes these law reform activities, these law reform campaigns takes a long time to, you know, see some success. We've been talking about the Environmental Bill of Rights. It took us 20 years of lobbying to get an Environmental Bill of Rights. And same with the Walkerton scenario. The safe groups like CELA and Pollution Probe and others have been arguing for safe drinking water legislation in this province since the early 1980s. It took 20 years of lobbying and people dying in Walkerton to get that new legislation in place. So when I advocate law reform, I also say you got to take the long view. That's not going to happen overnight, and it's only going to happen if we have a concerted, coordinated political, media, you know, public campaign to put the pressure on to get the job done. So I think we have the tools, we have the information we need to fix the EA process. We just need to convince the people at Queen's Park it needs to be done now.
Hello, my name's Jim Pashinsky, and I'm the chair of Ottawa Citizens Against Pollution by Sewage. It's kind of a related theme. I was also involved with the Spring Hill Tomlinson's dump expansion proposal in south of Ottawa back in the late 80s, early 90s. And we succeeded in getting that stopped for much the same reasons that people are here. It was on cracked limestone. It was already leaking. And but what we were able to do then is because I was actually, the people that lived adjacent to the dump asked me to be on the committee that the town council had established to look into this, to hold a public meeting, and I insisted that the people who lived in the area be given equal time to speak with the Tomlinson representatives. And this is something that you were referring to, not having the sufficient time. And that worked very well. In fact, it worked so well. There were 4 meetings scheduled in various parts of the township. After the first meeting, I said to the mayor, look, 95% of the people here are opposed to this, you know, after hearing both sides. Let's not hold the other 3 meetings. But he insisted, and 2,000 people had to get involved in order to get that stopped. Now, one of the outcomes of that I think you need to be aware of is that Tomlinson made agreements with the people that lived in the area that had formed this committee and swore them all to secrecy in return for whatever he gave them. I'd have no idea what. So they haven't been able to speak about this issue since. And so when Tomlinson decided he was going to blast the top 8 feet off of the last cell because he got the commission for all of Ottawa's construction waste. And I was the only person that could speak to this issue. And, you know, I'm saying, why are you going to dynamite on top of cracked limestone? You know, when you already have a leachate leaking out of it, it could accelerate that. And their response was, well, it could seal it too. You know, this is the official engineering response. So it's the kind of nonsense. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time, but there's another area here. What we've been finding and fighting this for like 10 years with regard to the sewage spreading is that like the city's response is, well, even if all of your wells got contaminated with city sewage that's being spread around, you're less than 5% of the city population, you people with rural wells. So that doesn't constitute an epidemic, you see? So there's no money for research, there's no money for investigating or even looking at this. And this is province-wide. This is coming from the Department of Health. So they won't look into this. And you are being treated as second-class citizens if you are a rural person. And the talk about Walkerton, one of the results of Walkerton, and I was there too, was that these conservation authorities were set up to ensure that municipal drinking water supplies in future would be protected. Okay? Well, And the environmental commissioner, he met with all of the chairs and said, congratulated them all on protecting 85% of the population of Ontario, their drinking water. Well, the other 15% are all of us rural people with private wells, and there's no protection for us. You cannot. So this is another thing that you're dealing with, you know. So your wells get contaminated, so what? There's no provincial protection for that. And this is the attitude. The other, those two things, risk management, which deals with it, is a numbers game, and it says not enough people are going to be harmed by this because there's not enough people living in the area. And then the other thing that, you know, that because that rural areas are really now regarded as industrial zones. And this is from the city of Ottawa telling people, oh, you have a problem with the sewage being spread next to you, it's making you sick? Move into the city. You know, that's where you have to live if you want to be safe now. The countryside is an industrial zone. You got to expect this. You don't move to the countryside for your health. You know, you move there because you got. So what they're doing basically is they're moving people, they're putting pressure on rural people to move back into the cities, to abandon the countryside. The countryside is becoming a waste zone for industry and for anything to take place. And by doing that, the way the civil servants look at it is they're reducing the costs. We don't have to provide ambulance service and schools and roads for people. They're very expensive anyway, these people with these little farms and stuff, you know? So much easier if we can just turn it all into wasteland, move everybody into cities. So that's all I've got to say. But that's what you're up against, and I think that this is part of a bigger picture that we all have to take a united stand to fight.
Hi, I have a question, quick question and a comment. Richie Allen. I'm here with a couple others. We're part of the local Council of Canadians group and provided some support for the local issues here. So my question is there anything to expect from the Wynne government of a change or no?
JB2?
Yeah, Jim Bradley 2.0. Well, I mean, that's why it's incumbent on all of us to put the pressure on the new premier and her government to do the right thing. I mean, there's likely going to be a spring election, or from what we hear, there's going to be a spring election. This needs to be an issue, not just locally or not just regionally, but it needs to be provincial. But it's up to us to make it an issue and fight for, you know, airtime alongside all the other 110 pressing issues of the day. And that we have to basically make it an issue that is too hard for her to ignore or that she ignores at her peril. I mean, we're really talking about political accountability. That's the main mechanism for fixing the law that's broken right now for all the reasons you've heard tonight.
So there's no indication that she'd be more in favor or not? I know we've sent her a letter about the issue, but haven't not heard back in a way.
Well, I'm not sure it's gone up that far up the ladder yet. I mean, the EBR application for review that went in was decided by ministry technocrats. I'm not even sure Jim Bradley knew anything about it, but he's going to hear about it, and so will the premier. So we just need to ratchet up the pressure and bring it upwards and make it a more government-wide thing. And we just can't focus on what some people at Approvals Branch are saying in, you know, St. Clair Avenue in Toronto.
Right. My comment was that in terms of what issue it is, and it's not an NIMBY issue, and it's not this and that, and I think there's the other large stakeholder is the land and the environment, and that I haven't heard it quite verbalized here tonight, but it's just too important an issue for us to be poisoning all our water for short-term financial gains for someone. And it's not just this province, it's across the country. It's across the world. So I think that's really one of the reasons we're so involved in it here, is to protect the water.
You know, you're absolutely right, because if I in this mediation process that we go through with the Environmental Review Tribunal, at the last meeting we had, I left there, and it was just something was just nagging at me and really bothering me about what was going on. It was there, but it just wasn't coming to front of mind. And what it finally was the fact that everybody around the table felt it. And, you know, and talking earlier about the contaminant attenuation zone, everyone around that table finds it perfectly acceptable to contaminate the environment, as long as there's no human health issue. And they'll hide that human health issue for as long as they possibly can. But polluting the environment for hundreds of years, piece of cake, not a problem, right? And that, you know, at the end of the day, I just went, that is wrong. That is just plain wrong. We have got to wake up as a race and just decide that we can't let this go on any longer. It's just stupid. That we will build industrial infrastructure, waste infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, that is going to pollute the land for hundreds of years, so that land is worthless and can't be used for anything else. We may have lots of land, but it's shrinking, and it's shrinking fast because it's not going to be usable land any longer.
Can I ask a question as moderator? There are a lot of people here, the majority of people here are of a certain age, and I'm wondering about this issue of public engagement and young people being involved in getting involved in these issues at the political level, in terms of expertise, in terms of organization at the community level, and so on. I wonder what your experience has been in trying to make contact and engage young people in taking up these issues, because it is an issue for them and for the future.
In our community, we wanted to go to the schools to get them involved, to get the kids to realize that this issue was in their community. And a lot of the schools, unfortunately, they felt it was too political. And they didn't want the kids to be involved in political issues. Even though it's not, it's an environmental issue. And this is the generation that's going to have to live with the concerns of this landfill. I'm not going to have to worry about it too much longer, but they will. And so that was we were very disappointed. We actually had a contest where we were giving prizes for high school students that would produce video, not particularly the landfill issue itself, but just the whole trash and recycling issue. We got very, very few, because the schools didn't promote it. They didn't want to get involved. And so that was our concern. But it can work, because when we had to present to council back in 2007, there was one high school student who just about brought the council to its knees. She was so passionate in her talk to the councillors that if we can get the young people involved, they have a really strong role to play, but it's hard to get them involved.
Harry, you wanted to say something earlier?
Yes, we've been to the two high schools in our community and made presentations to science groups and things. Again, they're very interested in the issues, and the teachers might do something with that. It's very hard to get them more engaged in that. At the local fair, we engage the children in looking at the types of flora and fauna that we find at these sites, and show them photographs of the butterflies and things, and why don't we have any more monarch butterflies in this region and things like that. And they're interested, but again, to go beyond that, to be able to use that, springboard that into something larger is very hard. When the terms of reference came out, they were sent to all the school boards, and the school boards looked at and said, what's this for? What are we supposed to do with this? So the proponents sent terms of reference to the school boards, and school boards didn't know what to do. So they were expected to have some input, but they didn't even know what it was that they needed to give input to.
Mike, and then we'll go to the floor.
So similar issue. We had wanted to do things at the high schools and stuff like that, and a lot of the principals were really, really standoffish, but we were able to find science teachers. My kids have been involved since they were this high in this fight, and they both brought it to their high schools and elementary schools. They did speeches and all that stuff, and it's great. I mean, we did generate interest, and you do, but it's constant churn, right? Because they leave, they go on to university, they come back, they may not come back. I think it's instead of focusing, having the high school kids involved is very good, but really you need the 30-somethings involved. They're having kids. They're now starting to be concerned about their kids and their kids' futures. And that's the group that we've really got to try to attract. They're the busy group, so you can't overwhelm them with it, but you've got to find a way to deliver a simple message that resonates with them and their concern for their children, and bring that, and that's the group. And so the way you position it with them is, we don't need you to be out there demonstrating. We don't need you to be out there working to help build the campaign. We need you to be there to be part of the campaign, writing letters, signing petitions, getting your friends to sign petitions, passing it along on Facebook or whatever the other case, and any other ways that you can engage them where it's a minimal amount of time on their part because they're so busy raising their families.
Yes, my name is Sami Assad. I live in Carp, so we're fighting against the Carp landfill expansion. The Carp landfill is, I think, is unique, but then I listened to all your stories, and maybe it's not as unique as I believed it was. The initial landfill had half a liner, and so it's leaking. There is belief that also Waste Management did add additional garbage in areas where there is that they weren't supposed to put it in, and that's leaking too, even though it's not yet proven. The neighboring sites are contaminated. Some of these sites have been purchased by Waste Management, and other sites have not. The site that Waste Management wants to put the new landfill is also contaminated. It's owned by L'Horizon. But right now it's an option to buy. My belief was, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, that if you contaminate a neighboring site, you have to purchase that site and then turn it into an attenuation zone. Right now, Waste Management and the Ministry of the Environment is going to probably allow Waste Management to purchase the L'Horizon property, which is already contaminated, and put a landfill on it. Now, if you put a landfill on this site, then the question is, well, what's going to be the attenuation zone? And to me, it only makes sense it's going to turn out to be into neighboring properties. I don't understand how this can move forward with the Ministry of Environment. But I have one question is, how contaminated must a neighboring property, or how contaminated must the water of a neighboring property be before it actually rings some alarm bells?
Can I?
Well, yeah, why don't we let the geologist and then
Okay.
and the lawyer?
Do you want to hear from the engineer?
Engineer too.
I think you meant you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm a geological engineer, so
He's both.
I can do both.
Both hats.
No, I was going to say that you've heard the term attenuation zone. So right now, MOE will allow landfills to leak and to maintain this attenuation zone. So attenuation zone's got to do with the monitoring wells that go around, So it pollutes. When is the pollution too much? It's if it's a drinking water well and the drinking water standards are corrupted by the leachate. So these wells are not drinking water wells, these are monitoring wells, so they can be polluted. So basically what they have to do is they have to keep buying land. This is acceptable. MOE, it's acceptable to pollute the groundwater as long as when you pollute it, you gotta buy it. Pollute it, you purchase it. And so and they said before 1980, anything that's been there since before 1980, that's an approved method of dealing with the landfill. And remember, that contamination plume or contamination is going to keep going for thousands of years because these things are not being cleaned up. The things that polluted are still there. Engineers like to cover it with clay, thinking that if you don't have the rainwater coming down, you're not going to get the leachate going out. But the fact is, there's other things in there that are happening, and those things will continue to happen for hundreds of thousands. So that's why we're concerned about the future.
So I agree with you.
Yeah.
But how contaminated must the water be for it to raise some heads and awareness on this issue?
Okay, so the reference that's normally used are the numerical standards that are set out in the Ontario Water Quality Drinking Standards. And that regulation sets out a number of, limits, and I'm sure you've read them, for a number of parameters that are associated with leachate and other sources of contaminants as well. What the ministry has in place is something called the reasonable use guideline, and you've probably heard that term lots of times. And so what happens is, if there's evidence that the leachate is moving off-site, And maybe they'll do some off-site domestic well testing, maybe they'll drill some new wells to figure out how much is there and whatever. But the reference isn't to what the standard is. Let's say the standard for a particular substance is 1 microgram per liter. That's what it's 1. What the ministry is going to be looking for on a reasonable use basis is 25% of that, because we don't want to, do nothing until we've already reached or exceeded the standard. We want to do some preventative stuff. So that's 25%. So if they found that, the material showing up in the domestic well offsite at, 0.25 micrograms per liter, that's when they need to start thinking about a contaminant attenuation zone. The problem that we're encountering at Richmond is everywhere they look, there's reasonable use exceedances. So we haven't found the outer edge of the plume yet, so we're going further and further afield and not cutting off the discharge at source. So that's the short answer.
I think the item you're looking for is the maximum allowable concentration for drinking water quality. So if one of those parameters exceeds that, is that enough to raise some eyebrows?
Well, actually, they're looking for less than the parameter. They're looking for a quarter of what the parameter is, what the drinking water standard is. That's all I'm going to say about that.
So if we find drinking water outside the limits of the landfill zone, which have exceeded these parameter levels of concentration, what are we to do?
Well, I'm not dispensing legal advice, especially in a case that I'm not involved in, especially in public. But, one of the other things I do besides environmental assessment cases is we sue polluters for that very thing. So if there's evidence of contaminants in somebody's well at or above the applicable drinking water standard, guess what my option is going to be?
But if it's somebody else's well, it's not yours.
Well, I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about the landowner. The affected landowner, one of the options that he or she can consider is, do you have enough evidence to sue?
The question is, what if we prove that there's contaminants outside the landfill, but it's not your property? It's somebody else's?
Oh, you're talking, okay. Well, you're not suing, because you have no status to sue with respect to somebody else's well. The only thing you can do is you might use an environmental bill of rights tool to force the ministry to issue an order to amend the approval, or otherwise require preventative measures or the extension of the CAZ.
I'll try to be brief. My name is Vincent Lavoie. I'm also involved in the carp landfill fight since 2006, and it's been a long time. So I understand Mike. He says it's been a longer time because he's been a longer time. Feel your pain, yeah. And I feel it's strange that you said before 1990, before Mike Harris, the proponents were complaining the process was too long and it was costing them too much to run the assessment with the long hearing process and all that. The government changed it. Now the proponents has the ball, basically, and now they tire us, right? Waste Management has gone through 3 tours before they finally got one approved, and 1 EA, and now we have the EA approved. And even for the duration of this EA, they were shoveling the arguments forward. We went, what's the need? Prove us that you have a need for 8 million cubic meters of landfill here. They never responded to that. We asked that to the MOE, because obviously you can't ask Waste Management. They said, no, we're a business, we're going to try to justify it. So you asked the MOE said, no, we don't have to justify that, they're going to answer you in the EA process. We went through the EA, we asked the same question. Oh, well, not right now. And during the approvals, the EA part, we asked to meet them, as Harold said, and they refused to talk to us. They wouldn't meet us. Finally, now that the EA is approved, we finally had a meeting 2 weeks ago with the local district branch, and nice people, all that, and then they say, well, we can't really do anything anymore because now it's the ACA process. So it's totally flawed and against the landowner, against the neighbor. Ottawa is going to be known as the dump capital of Canada, right? There's going to be 7 dumps in the area here. That's where we're going. It's ridiculous. You're going to have a nice big dump on the east end when you drive from Montreal. There's going to be a nice big dump on the west end when you drive in from North Bay and Ottawa. This is pretty ridiculous. And what do we do to stop it? Well, I think the political getting the political awareness and political engagement is the only way. I think it's hard. I'm not the political beast. I'd rather be home and quiet. I don't know how to do it, but I'm trying a little bit. But it's hard to get people engaged. We had in 2006, 2008, we had a fair bit of engagement in the west side because it stank like hell, so people rose up. So now even if you drive through Stittsville today, they say, no, it's gone, it's a dead issue, and now we're finally reviving it a little bit. Because, oh, it's not done? It's coming back? Yes, it's coming back, because waste management has never given up. The current landfill, which has been closed in 2011, has a contamination lifespan of 124 years. That's the one that's there. It's been built, it's known it's going to be 124 years. Well, the new one that they're planning over the same spot, the model says is going to have a contamination lifespan of more than 320 years. Well, that's almost longer than Canada has existed. Why do we allow that? So part of the political push is to say no more landfills. And how do you do no more landfills is, you need to have a better solution at disposal, and you need to have the less need for disposal. I'm not going to go zero waste. I think that's utopia, and I'm sorry for the real ecologists, more green guys, but I think you need to reduce the need for disposal. The Ministry of Environment and the province of Ontario has goals to have 70% diversion. They do nothing to enforce it. The cities do some things to enforce it. Ottawa is doing pretty good. We're at 42, 43% now, Harold. The province at 12 or 13. Well, as long as we don't reduce, reuse, and recycle, you're going to have to make giant holes in the ground and do what we're talking about. And, so enforce the mechanism, put major fees on landfills. It's costing us a lot of money to do these landfills. We think it's the cheapest way. Well, it's not the cheapest way if it's going to pollute for 300 years. I'm sorry. And it's unfortunate that we can't get more people than that for an issue like this on a night like tonight. So thanks everybody for the effort. We're still there, we're still fighting. Talk to your neighbors, try to get them engaged. That's what we need to do, but it's a hard fight. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Carolyn Butts. I'm with Mike Bossio's group, the CCCTE. I was just in Montreal a couple of weeks ago for the Waste and Recycling Expo, and I went there to see what is the future of waste, where are these companies going, what is their focus. A couple of things I learned was the incinerator in Durham is going to be started up next year. They're going to start running, it's in construction right now, they're going to start doing some test burns to test for pollutants, air pollutants. I'm not sure if that's the solution, but I want to know if anybody here could comment on the waste industry. We haven't talked about the companies and the possible coercion, corruption that exists, that I believe exists. I don't think these are waste companies. I think they're more trucking companies. I think they make money in trucking. Are the Teamsters Union a part of this industry? We've had people threatened in our committee. What are we fighting against? What is an incinerator going to do to the waste industry that is basically a trucking company or is looking for landfill? And how do they work? How are they communicating? I find that if you try and talk to one company, they don't answer the questions. They protect each other, even though they're different companies with different landfills. So I don't know who can make comments about this industry. And I think politically, we have to find solutions, as the last fellow just said. Give solutions. I know that one of the companies in Montreal at the Expo, they can now tear open bags and sort garbage. You don't have to hand sort at home, and they can remove 80% of the recyclables on a site. So why doesn't a company like Waste Management build these plants where they are reducing on the site? 20 years of landfill is not very long. So they're going to be looking for another site. So I don't know, I'm looking for any insight into these companies.
It's 9:15. That's a question, a very, very open question that certainly deserves a lot of discussion. And
I think the Charbonneau Commission has changed a lot of what people's thinking. I spent 2 days like McGonsick, and I know it changed the line of thinking in the Ministry of Environment there. They had a huge catastrophe. And when the Charbonneau Commission came about, the trucking industry took a back step and delayed everything for us. So there may be something to all of that. I don't know. Overall, I did thank Candace for proposing. You guys are all here, and I tip my hat to all of you here. It is not your problem. It's not ours. It's our problem as a whole. And we have to move politically on this thing. And I tip my hat to all of you guys for stepping forward tonight and expressing yourselves the way you have. So my hat to you guys. Thank you very much.
I would like to ask the panelists just one last comment, and perhaps if we could focus it just a sentence, a couple of sentences on how to organize, how to pull together, how to build a coalition that has more clout and more capacity to take action. Mike, do you want to start?
I think I already partially addressed this. That yeah, I mean, an alliance is definitely the way that we have to go. It is a big job. It's a big task. I probably put 3 to 6 hours a day into this, you know, you have to. I love where I live. I'm not going to let some big American corporation come in and destroy it. And I'm very fortunate. I mean, I've got 5 people here with me today from our group that we drove down together. I'm very fortunate that I have a really strong, committed group of individuals that feel the same way. And most of us aren't even going to be impacted by this dump. But we care. We love where we live. And I get the sense that everybody here at this table does too. And I'm not, you know, talking from one person's experience. I'm sure all of us are putting in that kind of time. It takes that level of commitment to change people's thinking, to change the way they do things. I generate 1 to 2 bags of garbage a year, right? It's not impossible to do. You just have to decide you're going to do it. Educate, regulate, and people can't do it on their own, so you've got to help to educate them. And once again, it's getting out there, getting the message out there as far and wide as possible, in any way possible, to help people understand that this is such a serious issue. It's not something to be, we just have to decide we're going to do something about it.
Suzanne?
Sorry, I went over again. Oh, sorry, Suzanne, there you go.
I'll just
I
totally.
hogged this with Suzanne all night.
I'll just totally agree with Mike that it's really all about sharing information with our communities, and that's one of the main things that Opal decided we were going to do when we formed. Is that we weren't just going to be talking to the politicians and talking to the province and talking with the proponent. Is that we wanted to gather the information and share it with as many people as possible so that they understood, you know, what was proposed to happen in their communities. So. We've used social media a lot, and we have print newsletters. We try to have things in the newspaper and on the radio and in other media as often as possible. And basically, there's a lot of people that think when something like this comes in, it's a done deal, and there's nothing they can do about it. And they kind of develop this defeatist attitude about it, and you sort of have to change one mind at a time, and that's just done by sharing information.
Yeah, we have to show the political people in Toronto that it's not a bunch of small groups of people. When we had our meeting with the minister, it definitely came across the table that he's concerned of how many people are upset at this issue. And his feeling was that a landfill only influences a certain number of people around it, and they're not a large number of people in terms of the provincial issues. And we have to convince them that it is. It's everybody's problem, like somebody said. It's not just the people living around it. And I think an alliance of groups is going to be much stronger than going to the minister individually or going to the premier individually. We all, as we found out, we all have the same fight. It's all the same fight, so it's not 5 small groups or 6 small groups. It's one big group, and that's what we have to get an alliance going that has that body behind it.
This is a multi-million-dollar industry. The garbage is there. It's got to go somewhere. These guys get tipping fees for dumping it off at their site, and what's the cheapest thing for them to do? Throw it in a hole. And why are they doing it? Because they're allowed to by MOE. And so that's got to change. But also, I think one of the things we need to do is to change our own outlook and not always be against something. Let's be for something. Let's start promoting the 3 R's. Let's start to, on a grassroots level in our communities, use our influence to educate and to get people starting to think about what they're doing with their own waste as individual residences and industries and commercial operations. I think that we can play a role there too. So if we can cut them off, if you will, at the other end, the source, then we can start to bite into their impact their bottom line. And it's a big business. Waste is the new gold.
From our perspective and the whole coalition, standing together as a united front, I think there's a lot of value in there because the power of the people can make this happen. From one of the newer groups that is just embarking down this particular road, the other thing is we were very thankful to have the Russell group there to provide guidance, to help strategize, to help guide us and lead us into this unknown territory for many of us. So I find that a lot of, the new communities out of there or anybody who's facing a similar type project, if we can band together as well and share experience, whether that's on dump busters or whoever, some kind of mechanism where they can go through. If they need help, they can have a contact and come and stand side by side with us so that we can teach them and show them, as opposed to starting over from scratch every time. To that effect, I'm just going to do a little promotion here. We do have a town hall meeting for our local community at the Carlsbad Springs Community Center tomorrow at 7 o'clock. It is an education campaign to give them a status of where we're at, what we're doing, what our next steps are, and how we need them and how they can help us in this endeavor. So if you want to get more information, you're all welcome to participate.
Richard.
I think the main lesson that I learned from the Richmond Landfill EA Round 1 is that the only reason we convinced the minister to say no to the expansion was because of the concerted, ongoing collaboration of the concerned citizens group, local landowners, the Mohawks of Bay of Quinte, and the local township. But for that really strong connection between the interested parties, there's no way we would have had success at the local level. And I see the same sort of template for success at the provincial level. The only way we're going to make any tangible improvements in our landfill approvals process and the environmental assessment process is if all the interested groups continue to work together and provide the unified front, as Sue just pointed out. There's no doubt, as I think Harry just said, the Ontario waste industry is a very powerful, very big, very well-connected lobby group. They're at Queen's Park. They have the Ontario Waste Management Association speaking for all the people who haul and burn and bury waste in this province. So we're up against, a pretty tough opponent. But on the other hand, as a lawyer, I see that, the laws that we have in place are really expressions of public policy. We can make laws, or we can tell our legislators to make laws as stringent or as weak as we care to make them. So if we want to continue to live with weak landfill laws, I guess that's a choice. But if we want to improve it, if we want to strengthen the regulatory regime that we operate under, that's the message that needs to be heard loud and clear in Queen's Park. So we have to work, at the grassroots level, regional level, provincial level. We need to make a lot of noise. I've worked closely enough with enough MOE people to know that one of the first things that the minister's staff does every morning is look at the newspapers, get the media scanned, figure out who's making noise and about what, and is the Ministry of Environment being dragged through the mud again? That's what they fear. That's what they don't like. And so, to my mind, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to make noise, we need to drum up the pressure, and we need to make things happen at Queen's Park. So I'm hoping that tonight's event is a stepping stone towards that. I hope that we'll continue to work closely with each other and reach out to other affected communities and get that unified front presented forcefully and vigorously at Queen's Park.
I'm sorry, David, can I add one quick thing to what Richard just said there? And I can't believe I forgot this, because it was the prime message I wanted to deliver tonight. And that is that our group, our primary goal is to show other groups and to show these groups that a small little rural community can take on the world's largest waste company, one of the largest governments, and hold them accountable for the decisions and actions that they take. We've done it, right? There's no reason that we can't do it again and again and again if we decide that's what we're going to do.
I'd like to thank everybody, all the panelists, the participants in the audience and so on, and the organizers, Candace and others who've helped put this together. It's been very interesting, very lively, feisty crowd here. And the reward for all of this are refreshments donated by Doug and Cheryl Estabrooks and the North Russell Women's Institute over on the table here. Wow. So thanks to everyone, and I expect there'll be a flurry of emails tomorrow about how to get this continuing on from here.
Yes. Thank you.